0-0 on the clock. How does a bomber cancelled by one president, resurrected by the next, end up dropping satellite-guided munitions on cave complexes in Tora Bora, a mission nobody in 1977 or 1981 ever drew up on a whiteboard? And how does that same bomber, the one the Air Force nearly strangled in its crib twice, end up flying more combat sorties over Afghanistan than the B-52 it was built to replace? The B-1 Lancer. Variable sweep wings that tuck from 67 degrees spread to 15 degrees swept, depending on whether the pilot needs loiter time, or Mach 1.25 on the deck. 4 General Electric F-101, turbofans producing 30,000 pounds of thrust each in afterburner. A radar cross-section, roughly 1% of the B-52s. 3 weapons bays carrying 84 500-pound JDAMs, 84, on a single sortie. The airframe pulls more than 3 Gs at max gross weight, which for a bomber the size of a regional airport terminal qualifies as acrobatic. Jimmy Carter killed the B-1A in 1977, called it unnecessary. The stealth program, what became the B-2 Spirit, made it redundant before it ever reached a squadron. Ronald Reagan brought it back 4 years later as the B-1B, a redesigned, cheaper nuclear penetration platform built to fly under Soviet radar at 200 feet and 500 knots. The Soviets upgraded their look-down, shoot-down interceptors. The nuclear mission evaporated. By 1997, the B-1B lost its nuclear certification entirely. An airplane without a job, $66 billion in today's money, 100 airframes sitting on ramps in Kansas and South Dakota. If this is your kind of story, the machine they tried to kill that outlived the doctrine, the budget, the politics, and the Cold War itself, hit subscribe. Drop a comment on which bomber you think got the rawest deal, and like this so it finds the old heads who remember when the B-1 was a punchline. Then came Afghanistan. Then came Iraq. The crews who strapped into those cockpits turned a Cold War relic into the most requested close air support platform in theater. The infantry didn't care what it cost. They cared that it showed up in 8 minutes. The intake ramps alone tell the story. On the B-1A prototype, those rectangular scoops fed air to 4 General Electric F-101 engines through a variable geometry compression system, so complex that each inlet contained more moving parts than the entire nose section of an F-4 Phantom. The engineers at North American Rockwell designed them to sustain Mach 2.2 at altitude, air hitting the compressor face at temperatures exceeding 400 degrees Fahrenheit, the titanium skin radiating heat you could feel standing 20 feet from the taxiway. So why build this thing? The Advanced Manned Strategic Aircraft program started in 1962, back when Strategic Air Command still believed a bomber had to outrun what it couldn't outfly. The B-52, already a decade old, crawled at high subsonic speeds through Soviet airspace that bristled with more surface-to-air missile batteries every year. SAC wanted something faster, lower, and harder to kill. The XB-70 Valkyrie had just demonstrated Mach 3 at 70,000 feet, but 2 things murdered that concept. SA-2 missiles could reach it, and one of the 2 prototypes disintegrated in a mid-air collision over the Mojave in 1966, killing NASA test pilot Joe Walker and co-pilot Carl Cross. The Air Force buried high-altitude penetration with them. AMSA pointed in the opposite direction. Get under the radar. Fly at 200 feet in the weeds, where ground clutter blinds Soviet tracking systems, where the turbulence slams a crew against their harnesses, hard enough to bruise ribs through a flight suit. The airframe needed variable sweep wings to reconcile 2 contradictory requirements: long range at high altitude with wings spread, supersonic dash at low altitude with wings pinned back. Rockwell won the contract in 1970 and rolled out the first B-1A on 26 October 1974. It looked like nothing else on a flight line. Blended wing body, smooth as a river stone, the nose drooping slightly for visibility on approach. 4 prototypes flew a combined 179 sorties. Test pilots reported the low-altitude ride, terrain following radar coupled to the autopilot, threading canyons at 500 knots, produced a sensation less like flying and more like being swallowed. The vibration came through the seat and the stick, up through the rudder pedals and into the bones of your feet. Continuous, grinding, physical. The price came through just as hard. Each B-1A carried a unit cost north of $100 million, $1977. Adjust that forward, and it lands around $500 million today. The Air Force wanted 244 of them. Harold Brown, Carter's Secretary of Defense, ran the numbers against the AGM-86 air-launched cruise missile. A B-52 could carry 20 of them, launch from outside Soviet airspace, and never cross a defended border. The cruise missile cut out the $3 billion terrain-following radar development program. The crew of 4, the 12,000-foot runway. Each ALCM cost roughly $1 million. Expendable, accurate to within 30 meters, and nuclear-tipped. On 30 June 1977, Carter stood at a podium and killed the B-1A. The logic held together. The B-52 fleet still had structural life. The cruise missile neutralized Soviet air defenses at a fraction of the cost. And buried inside a classification compartment Carter couldn't mention publicly, Lockheed's Have Blue demonstrator had just proven that radar-evading stealth worked. A penetrating bomber might not need speed at all if it could become invisible. The 4 B-1A prototypes went to Edwards and NASA Dryden. 2 ended up on static display. The Rockwell engineers scattered to other programs. 7,000 subcontractor jobs in Southern California evaporated in a budget cycle. Carter's decision made sense in 1977. The problem with killing an airplane on logic is that logic changes. 4 years later, a new president looked at the Soviet Union, looked at the B-52's age, and reached a different conclusion entirely. We didn't bring back the same airplane. We brought back the name. That line belongs to a Rockwell engineer who worked both programs. The records don't identify him beyond his division, airframe structures, but the distinction he drew matters more than most things said about the B-1 in any decade. Reagan announced the B-1B on 2 October 1981. The press treated it as resurrection. It wasn't. The B-1B shared its predecessor's general shape the way a cousin shares a last name, enough to cause confusion, not enough to assume interchangeability. Rockwell redesigned the intakes from variable geometry to fixed serpentine ducts, curving the inlet path so radar energy entering the scoop bounced off internal walls and died before reaching the compressor face. That single change dropped the radar cross-section by an order of magnitude. It also killed Mach 2.2. The B-1B topped out at Mach 1.25, and even that required afterburner and a willingness to burn fuel at a rate that made logistics officers physically uncomfortable. The speed trade bought something more valuable than speed. Rockwell applied radar-absorbent material across the leading edges, blended the engine nacelles tighter into the fuselage, and redesigned the wing-body fairing to scatter returns rather than reflect them. The official radar cross-section remains classified. Unofficial estimates put it around 1 square meter, roughly the signature of a large bird on a Soviet radar screen. The B-52, by comparison, lit up at approximately 100 square meters. A MiG-31 Foxhound crew tracking a B-52 at 300 miles would need to close inside 40 miles to acquire a B-1B under identical conditions. 40 miles at closing speeds north of 1,000 knots buys maybe 90 seconds of reaction time. Suboptimal if you're the interceptor pilot. The structural changes ran deeper than radar signature. The B-1A used an escape capsule. The entire crew compartment separated from the airframe and descended under parachutes, a system weighing thousands of pounds that added complexity at every maintenance interval. The B-1B replaced it with conventional ACEs, 2 ejection seats, lighter and simpler, but also less survivable below 200 feet, which happened to be the altitude the bomber spent most of its time at during penetration profiles. The crews understood the math. At 500 knots and 200 feet, the ejection envelope narrows to something barely theoretical. The seat fires, the canopy fragments. Wind hits the body at 730 miles per hour. The chute needs altitude that doesn't exist. They strapped in anyway. The Offensive Avionics Suite, designated ALQ-161, represented the most ambitious electronic warfare system ever installed on a bomber. phased-array radar warning receivers covered every quadrant. Jamming transmitters targeted specific threat frequencies. Chaff and flare dispensers lined the belly and spine. The system could detect and classify a SA-10 engagement radar, then jam it before the missile left its rail. On paper. In practice, the ALQ-161 delivered roughly 60% of its designed capability through most of the 1980s. Software integration problems cascaded through every subsystem. Rockwell and Boeing passed blame back and forth in contractor reviews that fill boxes at the National Archives. Dry technical documents where the word unacceptable appears with regularity that suggests people stopped reading it. The Air Force accepted delivery of the first operational B-1B at Dyess Air Force Base, Texas, on 7 July 1985. The last of 100 airframes arrived in 1988. Total program cost landed at $28,1988. Unit cost, $283 million per aircraft, roughly 60% of the B-1A's projected price tag, adjusted for inflation. 100 bombers instead of 244, Mach 1.25 instead of Mach 2.2, a defensive suite that half worked, ejection seats optimized for an altitude band the aircraft rarely occupied. Just as Carter killed the B-1A on rational grounds, Reagan revived the B-1B on strategic ones. The B-52 force aging past its structural limits, the B-2 still a decade from delivery, the Soviet bomber gap yawning open in classified briefings that frightened senators more than the public ever knew. The B-1B filled a hole. Whether it filled it well enough remained an open question for another 15 years. What happens when a nuclear bomber runs out of nuclear missions? The Conventional Mission Upgrade Program answered that question starting in 1993. Engineers at Boeing ripped out the nuclear weapons hardware, rewired the avionics, and integrated GPS-guided munitions into bomb bays designed to carry B-61 and B-83 thermonuclear weapons. The modification cost roughly $3 billion across the fleet. Congress balked. The GAO issued reports questioning whether the B-1B should simply retire. The B-52 carried conventional ordnance already. The B-2 carried it with stealth. What exactly did the B-1 bring? Payload and time. Those two things, and nothing else, made the bone, the crew's word, derived from B-1, spoken fast, the most requested asset in two wars nobody planned for. On 7 October 2001, B-1Bs launched from Diego Garcia, flew north across the Arabian Sea, and dropped the first bombs of Operation Enduring Freedom on Taliban positions near Kabul and Kandahar. The round trip covered more than 4,400 nautical miles. Each sortie lasted roughly 12 hours. Crews rotated through tanker tracks over Pakistan, topping off fuel loads that burned at rates exceeding 40,000 pounds per hour in afterburner, settling to around 20,000 in cruise. The cockpit smelled like hydraulic fluid and old sweat, and the particular staleness that accumulates when four people breathe recirculated air for half a day, underlaid by the warm plastic odor of aging avionics. The seats vibrated at a frequency that settled into the lower spine and stayed there for days after landing. By mid-2002, B-1Bs flew less than 1% of combat sorties over Afghanistan, but delivered nearly 40% of the total bomb tonnage. That ratio, 1% of sorties, 40% of ordnance, shows up in CENTCOM after-action briefings with a consistency that borders on monotonous. 84 JDAMs per sortie. No other platform came close. An F-16 carried 2, an F-15E carried 6. A B-52 carried roughly the same number of JDAMs, but lacked the sniper targeting pod that the B-1 received in 2008, which gave crews the ability to track individual vehicles, individual fighters, from 25,000 feet. A Special Forces team leader in Helmand Province, speaking to Air Force magazine years later, put it plainly. When the bone showed up on station, we knew we had hours of coverage and more bombs than we'd ever need. That changed everything about how we planned. The Iraq numbers ran hotter. During the opening weeks of Operation Iraqi Freedom in 2003, 6 B-1Bs flew from Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar and delivered more precision munitions than the entire carrier air wing embarked on the USS Abraham Lincoln. 6 airplanes against 70-plus Navy jets. On 7 April 2003, a single B-1B diverted from its planned target set to drop 4 2,000-pound GBU, 31 JDAMs, on a restaurant in the Mansour district of Baghdad, where intelligence placed Saddam Hussein. The bombs hit 12 minutes after the coordinates reached the crew. Hussein survived. Sources conflict on whether he occupied the building at all, but the response time demonstrated something the Air Force had never advertised during the Cold War. The Bone could react faster than a fighter on alert. Cost per flying hour landed around $58,000, compared to roughly $70,000 for the B-2 and $35,000 for the B-52. Cost per sortie told a different story. When a single B-1 sortie replaced 6 F-16 sorties in ordnance delivered, the math collapsed in the Lancers' favor so completely that Air Combat Command stopped arguing about it. 2 presidents nearly killed it. Congress tried to retire it. The Air Force itself had decertified it from its primary mission, and yet it flew more combat sorties over Afghanistan between 2001 and 2015 than any other fixed-wing platform in the American inventory. Nobody at Rockwell in 1974 drew that on a whiteboard. The wing pivot bearing on a B-1B weighs roughly 600 pounds, a single machined steel assembly that lets a 137-foot wing sweep from 15 degrees to 67.5 and back again, thousands of cycles over decades. By 2020, fatigue cracks in those bearings grounded airframes faster than depots could repair them. The fleet shrank from 100 to 62, then to 45. The Air Force announced retirement plans in 2021, timed to the B-21 Raider's arrival at Edwards. The Raider flew its first flight on 10 November 2023, a stealth bomber designed from scratch for the Pacific, for contested airspace dense with Chinese HQ-9 batteries and J-20 interceptors. Everything the B-1B traded away in 1981, deep stealth, autonomous penetration, low observability across every spectrum, the B-21 reclaimed at a unit cost north of $700 million. The Air Force plans to buy at least 100. Just as Carter traded speed for cruise missiles, the Pentagon now trades the Bone's payload capacity for the Raider's invisibility. The pattern holds across 50 years. Every generation bets on a different survival mechanism, and every generation turns out to be partially wrong about which wars actually come. The B-1B never flew against Soviet air defenses, never launched a nuclear weapon, never performed the mission that justified $28 billion in procurement. Instead, it orbited over Kandahar at 25,000 feet, waiting for a radio call from a sergeant on a hilltop, and put 84 precision munitions exactly where that sergeant needed them. The airframe built to survive World War III spent its combat life as close air support for infantry platoons. Maintenance crews at Ellsworth and Dyess kept those aging jets flyable through chronic parts shortages, working double shifts on aircraft older than most of the airmen touching them. 72 maintenance man-hours per flight hour, more than double the B-52's rate. The crews and maintainers earned every sortie the hard way. 10 B-1Bs have been lost in crashes since the fleet achieved initial operational capability. 17 aircrew killed. The safety record improved after the first difficult decade, but never matched the B-52s. Those names appear in Air Force safety reports filed under routine classification headers, cross-referenced by tail number, date, and base of assignment. The formal retirement schedule designates the final B-1B withdrawal from service no later than fiscal year 2036. Each airframe's disposition, museum, boneyard, or scrapping carries its own line item in Air Force Materiel Command's divestiture plan, filed under Program Element Number 0401042F. A retired weapons systems officer from the 337th Bomb Squadron, Ellsworth, South Dakota, put 22 years on the Bone. He summed up the aircraft in 6 words to a researcher in 2019. They told us it was obsolete.